As the courtroom settles, your support truly helps. Subscribe, tap the like button, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from.
I've been on the bench a long time, and I've seen all kinds of people stand in front of me. But every now and then someone walks into that courtroom, and I hear my father's voice in the back of my mind. Your real character shows where nobody owes you anything. That morning, a woman walked in who reminded me of that exactly. It was a cool autumn day. You could smell wet leaves on people's coats. They came in shaking off the drizzle, wiping water from their sleeves, squeezing the last sip of coffee before sitting down. The low murmur of conversations floated through the room. School schedules, bus delays, small complaints about the weather, routine human noise. I was looking through the file in front of me. On the surface, it was nothing special parking on a crosswalk near an elementary school. Technically minor, but the officer's notes mentioned children stepping around the vehicle into the street. That changes the weight of a case, at least for me. I remember thinking, this should be a quick matter, but something about this one feels different. Then the door opened, and she came in. She didn't rush. She moved like someone used to being watched. Long, expensive coat that draped just right, jewelry that caught the light in small, deliberate flashes. Her heels clicked on the old floorboards at a calm, measured pace, as if the schedule of the courtroom belonged to her, not the other way around. Beside her walked a driver or maybe a bodyguard. It was hard to tell. He stayed half a step behind, carrying her bag, moving carefully, like he'd been trained not to get in the way of the main event. Her eyes swept across the room, not to meet anyone's gaze, but to pass over them. People were scenery. The courtroom was a set. I've met that look before. As she approached the front, she didn't pause to take in the room. She went straight to the podium, slid off a pair of leather gloves, and placed them on the edge of my bench, as if it were a hotel counter. A little too close, a little too casual. Let's make this quick, she said, not looking at me yet. My husband has a board meeting. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction given to the air, the kind of line that usually works everywhere else she goes. The room tightened. People in the benches went a bit quieter. An officer at the side lifted his chin just slightly. These are small reactions, but I've learned that the smallest ones often tell you the most. She finally looked up at me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was familiarity in it, as if we were colleagues about to review a minor inconvenience. The fact that she was in my courtroom at all seemed, to her, almost like an administrative mistake. She reached for her phone, tapped the screen, probably to check the time or a message, and that's when I saw it, just a tremor at the tips of her fingers. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was there. That tiny shake didn't match the rest of the picture. The perfect coat, the cool voice, the offhand reference to a board meeting. The outside said, I'm in control. Her hand said, not entirely. In all my years, I've learned to pay attention when those two stories don't match. So I looked at the gloves on my bench, at the woman standing there like she'd wandered into the wrong room. And I thought to myself, this isn't going to be about a parking ticket. This is going to be about what she thinks her time is worth compared to everyone else's. I remember glancing back at her file while she adjusted her gloves on the bench, as if reclaiming the space. The violation itself was simple on paper, just one of many that passed through my courtroom each week, but the circumstances around it told a different story. She had parked that towering SUV directly across a school crosswalk during dismissal, an hour when every parent on that block holds their breath until their child reaches the curb. Kids had been forced to weave around her bumper and step briefly into the street. An officer's notes mentioned a teacher waving her arms to slow cars while parents pulled children close against oncoming traffic. For those who didn't grow up in neighborhoods like mine, a crosswalk might seem like a strip of white paint. But in older parts of the city where the houses are modest and the people even more so, it becomes a lifeline. It's the one place where a grandmother feels safe crossing with groceries, where a child learns independence, where trust in the city begins. Seeing that trust interrupted by one person's rush unsettled me far more than the fine ever could. My father's voice came back to me the way it often does when I face situations like this. Frankie, you can measure a person's character by how they act when nobody important is watching. As I studied her from the bench, it felt like he was sitting right beside me. Then I noticed something that shifted the tone even before she spoke another word. Her record wasn't clean or even close. Over the past 14 months, she'd received 3 warnings in nearly identical situations, all within a few blocks of that school. Each time, she'd offered a different explanation. Late for a meeting, a mix-up with the driver, just a momentary stop. None of it illegal on its face, but all of it forming a pattern that was hard to ignore. Not malice, just a steady belief that the rules applied a little less to her. There was a line in one officer's report that stood out to me more than the timestamps or the photographs. He wrote, "Driver attempted to move. Woman told me to write the ticket quickly. She didn't have time to talk. When details like that make it into a report, it's rarely accidental. Officers don't editorialize unless something lingers in their mind." And as if the universe wanted to underline the point, the day before this hearing I received a media request. A reporter wanted to confirm whether the courtroom would be open to the public, not common for a parking violation, and I didn't need anyone to explain why. Influence has a long shadow in this city, and people tend to assume it reaches into courtrooms too. Earlier that morning, one of the officers had leaned toward me and said quietly, "Judge, she's used to people stepping aside for her." He wasn't being disrespectful, he was preparing me for the dynamic he'd seen on that street. I gave him a nod, but inside I thought, not in here, not today. Back in the courtroom, I asked her to confirm her address. It was the simplest, most procedural question of the morning. Yet something in her posture changed. The reply was polished, too polished, and held a tremor she tried to swallow mid-sentence. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, but the confidence she had walked in with had thinned around the edges. And in that small hesitation, I saw the beginning of something important. Recognition, perhaps, that this room didn't bend around titles or money or meetings waiting somewhere downtown. Recognition that she wasn't here as anyone's spouse or employer or social figure, just a person whose choices had affected people she had never met. I remember thinking, not without hope, that if she allowed herself to be honest, this day might become more than a hearing. It might become a turning point. I asked her to describe, in her own words, how long she had been stopped on that crosswalk. She didn't hesitate. "Less than a minute," she said, with the same confidence she might use when ordering someone to bring the car around. Her tone was smooth, almost rehearsed, as if she'd repeated that line enough times that it had become true to her. But when you've been a judge as long as I have, you learn that the truth and the version of the truth someone wishes to believe rarely sound the same. I opened the folder in front of me, slowly, not for effect, but because I wanted to take my time. I wanted her to feel that this wasn't a formality. I pointed to the first photograph, her SUV straddling the crosswalk. Then to the second, taken 9 minutes later, the vehicle in the exact same position. And then to the note that video footage from a nearby shop clocked her there for at least 12 minutes. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. She didn't turn to look. Her eyes stayed fixed on me, but her jaw tightened ever so slightly, as though holding back a breath she didn't want anyone to hear. Then came the first small fracture in her story. When I asked again why she'd chosen that spot, she said there were no available spaces nearby. It was a different explanation entirely from the first. A minute ago it had been less than a minute. Now it was a lack of parking options. That shift might have seemed subtle to her, but in a courtroom it sounded like two truths wrestling with each other. She adjusted her earring, a tiny gesture, quick but clear. People touch their face when they're embarrassed, their jewelry when they're anxious. I've watched thousands of people testify. These little signals become louder than their words. Her driver, standing behind her, lowered his eyes. He looked as though he'd been carrying the weight of this incident longer than she had. Perhaps he'd tried to warn her. Perhaps he'd been scolded for even suggesting it. I've seen that dynamic too many times to miss it now. The officer who had issued the citation stepped forward. He didn't change his tone, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Ma'am, I asked you to move twice. You told me, write the ticket. I don't have time." The words hung in the air like dust caught in a beam of sunlight, soft, quiet, unavoidable. For the first time since she'd walked into my courtroom, her face changed. She didn't frown. She didn't protest. She simply went pale. The way someone does when a truth they'd hoped would stay hidden appears right in front of them. I watched her take a breath that reached all the way to her shoulders. A controlled inhale, followed by a tremor in the exhale she tried to disguise. People often think the breaking point comes when someone yells or cries. But most of the time, it begins exactly like this, silently, in the space between pride and realization. Finally, she said, in a voice stripped of its earlier gloss, "Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly." It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't even a defense. It was the first genuinely human statement she had offered all morning. The courtroom shifted with her. Not physically, nobody moved, but the air itself felt different. People who had watched her stride in with the certainty of someone who expected a quick dismissal now leaned forward slightly softer in their judgment. Those small moments of honesty reached further than any lecture I could give. Her driver looked up from the floor for the first time. His eyes met hers briefly, and there was something tender there, relief, perhaps, that she'd finally spoken without the armor. A woman in the back row nodded to herself just once. These are small reactions, but they matter. A courtroom is not just a place of law. It's a place of reflection, a place where a community quietly responds to the truth as it unfolds. I sat back for a moment, hands folded, letting the silence settle. Silence has a way of revealing whether a person is still defending themselves or beginning to understand themselves. And in that brief stillness, I sensed she was stepping, maybe for the first time in a long time, out of the world where she was untouchable and into the world where her actions, like everyone else's, held consequences. I thought to myself, we finally reached the real beginning of this case. For a moment after her last sentence, the room was almost gentle. She'd said she wasn't thinking clearly, and there was a softness in her voice that hadn't been there before. I could feel the tension loosen just a little, and then it all snapped. I laid out the timeline one more time, not to humiliate her, but to make sure the facts were anchored. The photographs, the video, the officer's notes. I spoke slowly, giving her space to absorb it. When I finished, there was a short silence. She broke it too loud for the size of the room. "I don't see why this court treats me like some irresponsible person," she burst out. "My husband runs half this city." The last sentence hit the room like a slap, not at me, at everyone sitting behind her. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a declaration of rank, as if the people in those benches, the officer, my clerk, even the parents who trusted that crosswalk, were somehow on a lower tier of existence. The sound in the courtroom vanished. You could almost hear the dust settling. Somewhere in the back, a pen clicked once and then stopped, as if the person holding it suddenly remembered where they were. I thought to myself, there it is, the line. And she didn't just brush against it, she walked right over it. I set my pen down very deliberately on the bench. No theatrics, just a pause heavy enough that everyone felt it. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice even, "in this courtroom, Your husband's job has no jurisdiction. Here, responsibility is personal. Her face tightened like a muscle catching a cramp. She wasn't used to being answered that directly. You could see it in the way her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, then widened again as she recalculated the room. Inside, I marked the moment. This is where people either grow or dig in. The energy shifted. No one moved on the benches. Bodies went still, eyes fixed forward. The officer near the wall straightened by a hair's breadth, not in challenge, but in quiet solidarity with the idea that ranks don't follow you past the courtroom doors. Her driver, standing just behind her shoulder, laced his fingers together and squeezed them, knuckles whitening. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if bracing for whatever came next. You could feel the room waiting, balanced between two possibilities. It was either going to get uglier or more honest. Then a hand went up from the middle rows. A woman in her 40s, maybe, hair pulled back, coat still damp from the weather. Nothing about her stood out, and that's exactly why I trusted her presence. Ordinary people are the backbone of any courtroom. I nodded to her. Yes, ma'am. She stood only halfway, one hand resting on the bench in front of her for support. Judge, she said, voice shaking at first, my daughter uses that crosswalk every morning, every afternoon. Cars don't always stop. If someone blocks it, she has to step into the street. Her words weren't dramatic. They weren't rehearsed. They were the kind that come from a place between the throat and the heart, the kind of truth no lawyer needs to polish. She didn't look at the defendant, she just indirectly confronted. She kept her eyes on me, like a parent begging the world to remember their child. The defendant finally turned her head an inch in that direction, just an inch, but enough. For a brief moment, I saw something flash across her face that wasn't defiance. Confusion, maybe. Or the first sting of seeing herself from the outside. Then the moment passed, and pride came rushing back to plug the gap. So now I'm responsible for every child in this city? She snapped, whipping back toward me. Her voice cracked on the word every. The sharp edge of control she'd carried like a blade dulled suddenly into something far less steady. It wasn't power speaking anymore. It was panic. Panic at being seen as the villain in a story she'd never bothered to read from the beginning. The gallery didn't react with gasps or whispers. They just watched her, and in that silence you could feel judgment and something else. Pity, perhaps, for someone fighting so hard to protect a version of herself that was already slipping away. I looked at her and thought, when a person starts shouting, they're no longer arguing with the court. They're arguing with their own ego and losing. And that was the precise moment when the case stopped being about a traffic ticket and became about whether she would keep fighting that loss or finally let herself learn from it. I let her outburst settle, not because I needed the silence, but because she did. Sometimes the truth needs stillness to land exactly where it should. After her voice cracked, she stood there breathing too fast, her shoulders rising and falling beneath that tailored coat. Pride can feel like armor, but when it shatters, the pieces are sharp. I asked the officer to present the final portion of the record. He stepped forward, not triumphant, not eager, simply performing a duty he wished he didn't have to repeat. He held up a tablet, and I motioned for him to play the body camera clip. It began with his calm voice. Ma'am, please move your vehicle off the crosswalk. Her reply came through the speakers, unmistakable. Write the ticket. I'm late. No embellishment, no hostility, just the stark truth of someone who believed her minutes mattered more than anyone else's. Then the frame widened, and we saw what the paperwork could never fully capture. Children weaving around her SUV, backpacks bumping into each other as they leaned toward the edge of the road. a teacher stretching out her arm to stop a car whose brakes squealed just out of view. One girl hesitated, small, uncertain, before stepping around the bumper. That tiny hesitation was louder than any testimony I'd heard that morning. A quiet exhale drifted through the courtroom, as if everyone had collectively realized how close inconvenience had come to danger. I watched the defendant carefully. Her face didn't twist in anger this time. Her chin lifted, then lowered, like she was fighting between indignation and something truer. Her hands, which earlier had rested confidently on the edge of the podium, now slipped to her sides. "I didn't realize," she muttered, barely audible. Then again, steadier, "I wasn't thinking about them." It wasn't an apology, but it was honest. Honesty is harder for some people than remorse. There was a moment, fleeting but real, when she looked less like a woman defending her reputation and more like a person seeing the consequence of her habits for the first time. Her lashes fluttered rapidly, the way they do when someone is holding back tears they don't want anyone to notice. From the second row, the mother who had spoken earlier gave a small, grateful nod, not to me, but to the truth, finally spoken aloud. "Thank you, Judge, for letting me speak," she said softly. Her voice reshaped the room. It dissolved the tension, softened the edges of judgment, reminded everyone why we were here. Courtrooms are often mistaken for arenas, but they are really mirrors. They show people not just what they did, but who they were when they did it. The defendant swallowed hard, then said something unexpected. "Everything in my life is scheduled," she admitted. "Meetings, calls, events. I rush everywhere, maybe too much." Her voice cracked at the last phrase, not out of anger this time, but exhaustion. For the first time, she wasn't talking about status or influence or her husband. She was talking about herself, about the frantic rhythm she lived by and the corners she had cut because of it. I'd seen many people hide behind busyness as if it excused carelessness, but rarely had I heard someone acknowledge the cost of it. I paused before delivering my decision. Her eyes lifted toward me, this time without the bargaining confidence she'd arrived with, without the expectation that her world outside could rearrange the outcome inside. I told her the fine would stand for each violation, not reduced, not negotiated. And I required her to attend a session with the school's safety committee, not as punishment, but as education. She needed to understand the ripple effect of the choices she'd made in those few rushed minutes. Her chin dipped, not in defeat, but in recognition. She understood this wasn't about humiliation. It was about responsibility, something no amount of influence could outsource. Her driver exhaled behind her, shoulders loosening as if he'd been holding his breath for half the morning. The parents in the gallery didn't cheer or glare. They simply absorbed the moment with quiet acceptance. I thought to myself, consequences don't need to be loud to be meaningful. Sometimes they only need to be understood. After I delivered the ruling, she didn't move at first. It was as if her body needed a moment to catch up with the shift inside her. For the first time since she'd entered the courtroom, she wasn't searching my face for leverage or favor. She simply stood there, absorbing the weight of her own choices. Then she whispered, just loud enough for the room to hear, "I understand." No defense, no deflection, just two words that carried more sincerity than anything she had said all morning. Her shoulders softened. The tension that had shaped her posture seemed to melt, leaving behind someone less polished but far more human. The kind of person who finally saw not what she'd meant to do, but what she had actually done. From the back row came a quiet exhale, someone who had been holding their breath through the worst of the confrontation. The mother whose daughter used the crosswalk lifted her chin and gave a faint smile, not of victory, but of relief. A simple acknowledgement that the moment had landed where it needed to. Her driver, who had stood like a silent shadow through the entire ordeal, finally unclenched his hands. He didn't look triumphant, if anything. He looked grateful. Perhaps he'd been the one living closest to the consequences of her hurried decisions. I adjourned the session, and people began to file out. But she stayed where she was for an extra heartbeat, as though reluctant to step back into the world with the same pace she'd arrived in. When she finally turned to leave, her steps were slower, deliberate, almost measured. In a room where minutes had been her currency, she was suddenly spending them differently. Weeks passed, then months. Cases came and went, each carrying its own piece of humanity. I didn't expect to hear from her again. Most people move on, grateful to leave their courtroom version of themselves behind. So I was genuinely surprised when the school principal wrote to me. She attended the safety committee meeting, the letter said. She apologized to the parents. She stayed long after the session ended, asking questions about the children, the traffic flow, the challenges we face. She listened, really listened. I sat at my desk for a long time, holding that letter. Growth often shows itself in small gestures, not grand announcements. And those parents, those teachers, they hadn't asked for anything more than what she gave that day. Attention, humility, and time. A few weeks later, a small envelope arrived at the courthouse. No emblem, no assistant's handwriting, just my name in a slightly uneven script. Inside was a short note. Judge, I started leaving home 15 minutes earlier. I see things I used to rush past. Thank you for slowing me down before someone got hurt. No signature of her husband, no title, just a person speaking plainly to another. I slipped the note into a drawer where I keep the letters that remind me why I still sit on this bench after so many years. Not because every case leads to transformation. Most do not. But some, just a few, find their way into a part of a person that had been closed off for too long. Months later, the mother from the hearing appeared in my courtroom on an unrelated matter. When the case concluded and she headed toward the door, she paused, looked back at me, and said softly, "You helped her see us. That matters." Then she left, not waiting for a reply. She didn't need one. Her words stayed in the room long after she was gone. As the afternoon light filtered through the tall courtroom windows, I found myself thinking of my father again. He'd worked all his life without titles, cars, or influence. Yet he understood something many powerful people struggle to learn. And that's how I ended this memory in my mind, the same way I want to end it now. My father used to tell me, the world doesn't need you to be important, just responsible.